In the year of our Lord 1885, on the morning of the 17th of January, a cold descended upon the northern plains of such severity that the instruments in Minneapolis, when consulted, recorded 45 degrees below the freezing mark. This was not the measured cold of December, manageable and brooding. This was the cold of the uttermost north, the cold that pressed itself into every crevice and crack, that found the weakness in a man's lungs with the first breath drawn, that sought the heat of the living as a hunter seeks prey. But this cold also vindicated what one woman had built with her own hands and the inherited knowledge of her grandmother, that she might shelter not only her own daughters, but the township that had called her a witch and mocked her methods. Her name was Aino Niskanen, widow of 35 years, and the story of her vindication begins not in Minnesota, but in the boreal forests of Finland, where she learned from her grandmother Helmi the three-layered wall ceiling of the Karelian peoples, the Tilkitseminen, a method so particular to northern life, so suited to the extremity of cold and wet, that it would save lives in a village that had called her a witch. Aino was born in 1850 in the parish of Sotkamo, in the Kainuu region, a land of dark water and limestone ridges, where her father, Antti Hivarinen, worked the family's tar-burning kaski, the slash-and-burn croft that provided the family's bread. The summers were brief, the winters long, and the houses were not built by city carpenters, but by crofter hands that understood cold as a permanent neighbor. Her grandmother Helmi lived in the main cottage, a hirsitalo of squared logs, and it was Helmi who taught the young Aino the art that would become her salvation. The walls of the hirsitalo were fitted with logs that were notched at the corners, but the spaces between the logs had to be sealed against the cold and the damp. Helmi showed Aino the 3 stages. First came the sammel, the sphagnum moss, which Helmi harvested herself from the tamarack bog each summer, raking it up in long, pale ribbons and hanging it to dry under woven hay covers until it crackled between the fingers. This moss, Helmi explained, held warmth as a winter cloak holds heat against the skin. It did not compress to nothing like straw. It remained springy, and when the log shifted, the moss moved with them, cracking nothing. The second layer was the savilantalasti, the clay and cattle dung mortar. This was made by mixing blue lacustrine clay with fresh manure from the cattle, chopped rye straw for the fiber, and water until the mixture had the consistency of a fine mortar. Helmi worked it with her feet in a shallow pit, treading it as a washerwoman treads cloth. When this was troweled over the moss, it hardened to a shell that would not crack because the dung fiber held it in a gentle tension, and the clay could absorb and release moisture without becoming brittle. The third layer was the most sacred, Helmi said. This was the kalki, the slaked lime, which came from limestone burned in a stone kiln. Helmi mixed this lime with river sand and the combings of her own hair, and sometimes the hair shed by the cattle, and brushed it as thin as a finger's breadth over the cured clay dung layer. This lime coat became hard as stone itself in time, and it shed the rain and the snow as a duck's wing sheds water. Kolme kerosta, kolme rukausta seinale, Helmi would say. 3 layers, 3 prayers for the wall. And Aino, watching her grandmother's hands work the clay, the moss, the lime, understood that to build a house was not to defy the winter, but to make a bargain with it, to accommodate its strength rather than to resist it. When Aino was 22 years old, in the year of our Lord 1872, she married Eero Niskanen, a logger from Hailuoto, a man of the coast who understood timber and water. They departed Hanko in late May and sailed to Hull, then to Quebec, and down the St. Lawrence to the United States. They arrived at Hancock, Michigan, in a settlement of Finnish timber workers, and there Aino gave birth in autumn to their first daughter, Helmi, named for the grandmother. But Eero was a logger, not a farmer, and the logging work pulled him westward. In 1879, after some years following the timber boom to the upper Mississippi, Eero found his way to Cokato Township in Wright County, Minnesota, where there was a growing settlement of Finn families, the Mackey brothers, the Pulkkinen clan, the Koskinens, the Saris, people from Sotkamo and Kuopio and Pihajarvi who had come to the Minnesota wilderness as their fathers had worked the forests of the Grand Duchy. Eero claimed a quarter section of land in Section 19, a south-facing slope above an unnamed creek, and he and Aino began the terrible work of clearing the land. In the autumn of 1880, their third daughter Inkeri was born. By then Eero had raised the first courses of a hirsitalo on the stead, and Aino, nursing the infant, understood that she had found her place. She could see, in the way the land drained to the creek, in the north ridge of hardwoods that would break the winter wind, that this was ground suited to the 3-layer method. By the following spring, the frame stood complete, an 18 by 24-foot rectangle, a foot and a half tall above the ground course, divided into 6 rooms: the main kitchen, a parlor, 2 sleeping chambers, a loft for the daughters, and beneath the kitchen floor, a root cellar for the winter stores. Then, in the spring of 1882, Eero was taken. He was working a log drive on the Mississippi at Sauk Rapids, riding the raft as it ran the rapids in flood time, and a runaway timber shift caught him beneath a pine tree, and he was gone from the world. He was 34 years old. The logger who survived the accident brought word to Aino by way of a Finn neighbor, and Aino understood that she was now a widow with 3 daughters and $147 in cash, and that the only asset that could not be taken from her was the knowledge that lived in her hands. She filed her widow's homestead claim on the 11th of May, 1882, the same stead that Eero had begun. The Homestead Act provided that a widow of a homesteader who had died before the patent, the final certificate of ownership, could claim the land in her own name and complete the residence requirement herself. Aino's daughters were old enough to work. Helmi, now 9 years old, was clever and quick with language, already able to translate English into Finnish and back again. Saima was 6, and Inkeri, at 2 years old, was old enough to watch the goats and play in the dooryard while her mother worked. Now came the years of the triple-chinking. In the summer of 1882, Aino hired Mikko Pulkkinen and his son to help her raise the frame further, while she herself began the slow work of preparing the 3 layers. The tamarack bog lay 3/4 of a mile to the northeast. Aino, in June, when the moss was driest and the bog plant was most ready, walked that path carrying a wooden rake and a woven bag. She raked the sphagnum moss from the hummocks and gathered it into long, pale ribbons, working from mid-morning until the afternoon sun began to decline toward the forest. She made the journey 4 times that summer, each time returning with her arms full of the weightless moss, and she spread it on her dooryard, covered with old hay-rick cloth from Eero's tool shed, letting the summer sun and wind dry it to a crisp paleness. By the end of July, she had harvested near to 2 tons of dried sphagnum. It lay in bundles stacked under the hay cloth like the silver pale hair of some vast sleeping creature. Her daughters helped her beat the dust from it, striking the bundles with wooden flails until no more dust rose in clouds. Helmi and Saima took to this work with the solemnity of ritual, understanding that this was the layer that would hold the cold at bay. The second layer required her to find clay. In the cut bank of the creek below her stead, there lay a deposit of blue lacustrine clay, the remnant of the glacier lakes. Aino worked the creek bank with a wooden spade, loading basket after basket of the clay. It weighed like stone once it was wet. She piled it in a shallow depression near the cabin, and when the cattle manure from her own Vilma, the Suomenkarja heifer that Eero had brought as a calf, was mixed in, she had the dark, fibrous mortar that smelled of earth and of the cattle pen, a smell that the neighbors noticed, and that would later become, in their mouths, the name Mud Witch. The troweling of this mortar onto the moss took weeks. Aino worked from scaffolds that the Mackey brothers built for her, daubing the clay-dung mortar with a wooden float over the deeply packed moss, smoothing it to a thickness that she could measure with her finger. She worked inside and outside the walls, and her hands became stained with the dark clay, a stain that soap and water would not remove in winter. Some of the neighbors who watched her work said that the clay never washed from her hands, that she carried the mark of the witchwork into the spring. By the time the summer turned to autumn, the clay-dung mortar had cured to a leather-like firmness on all the log seams. It had hardened from the outside in, and now came the third layer, the layer that would protect all that lay beneath. This required the burning of lime. Aino and Eero had built a small stone kiln in 1880, a simple dome of stones mortared with clay, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, with a firebox at the base and a draw hole at the top. This kiln stood near the cabin, and Aino had the knowledge, inherited from her grandmother, of how to fire it. She gathered hardwood slash from the forest, the offcuts from the timber sawing and from the lightning falls, and she dried it carefully, never allowing it to become wet. When she had a sufficient pile, perhaps 8 cords of dry wood, she began the burning. The limestone had been gathered from the field stones on her stead. She selected stones that she judged to be pure limestone. In September, on a dry day, she loaded the kiln, layering stones and wood and stones again until the dome was full. Then she lit the fire. The kiln burned for 3 days and 3 nights. Aino kept the fire fed, watching the smoke change color from white to gray to a faint blue, the sign that the limestone was being calcined. Her daughters helped her, Helmi most of all, learning the patience required for the burning. When the kiln cooled, there lay the quicklime, white and hot. It had to be slaked in a wooden pit and aged for 90 days minimum, covered and kept moist, while it became slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, the substance that would become the weather coat of her walls. While the lime aged, she gathered the other materials for the final coat. The river sand she collected from the creek, sifting it to remove the larger stones. The haircloth fibers came from her own hair, from Vilma the cow, and from the hair combings that Helmi and Saima and Inkeri yielded to her comb each evening, their long fair hair being a resource for the wall. By the time the 90 days had passed and the autumn rains began, she was ready. She mixed the slaked lime, now white as chalk, with the fine river sand in proportions that she judged by eye and hand, the way her grandmother had taught her, until the mixture was of a consistency that could be brushed onto the clay-dung mortar. She added the haircloth fibers, stirring them carefully with a wooden paddle. Then, in the amber light of October, she began to brush and float this lime coat over all the external seams of the hirsitalo, working methodically from the foundation upward. The brushwork was fine and careful, deliberate. She applied the lime in a layer only 3/8 of an inch thick, smoothing it with a wooden float as it began to set, creating a surface that would shed water like the roof of a barn, a surface that would not crack under the freeze-thaw cycles of the Minnesota winter. By the time the first heavy frost came in November, the lime coat was carbonating, becoming harder with each day that passed, absorbing carbon dioxide from the air and converting itself into calcium carbonate, the substance that had already formed the stone itself. The transformation would take 2 to 3 years to complete fully, but the wall now had its 3 layers in perfect order. The sammal deep within, holding warmth and yielding gracefully to the movement of the logs. The savilantalasti pressed over that, flexible and adhesive, moving with the seasons, and the kalki coat without, shedding rain like feathers, breathable and steady, allowing the interior moisture to pass outward while preventing the weather from driving inward with its bitter cold and damp. The township took notice of her work, and not all of it was admiring. Aino was not the only Finn in Cokato Township. There were others from the Kainu region, and a few old Karelian settlers like Antero Koskinen, who knew the 3-layer method. But there were more Yankees in the surrounding sections, merchants in the village, farmers from the established regions to the east, a congregational minister, and a schoolmaster. These people saw the Finns as a curiosity at best, and as a threat to the character and stability of the community at worst. By October of 1884, a formal complaint had been written. It came from Hiram Throckmorton, who kept the general merchandise store in Cokato Village and had already taken offense at the Finnish settlers' creation of a store of their own, where the Mackeys sold goods to their own people, and from Reverend Phineas Crandall, who pastored the Cokato Congregational Church and had come to see the Finnish settlement as an affront to civilized Christianity. In their letter to the General Land Office in Minneapolis, they alleged that the Finnish element are erecting witchcraft-patterned dwellings of dung and clay, unfit for civilized habitation, threatening the moral and sanitary character of the township. The complaint reached the office of a man named Cyrus Pelham Whitcomb, who held the title of Special Inspector for the General Land Office in the Minneapolis district. Whitcomb was a man of 49 years, born in Brattleboro, Vermont, educated at Yale, a failed lawyer who had made his career in the land office through an unswerving loyalty to the paperwork of his employer. He believed himself to be a scholar, and he carried with him the writings of men who preached the supremacy of what they called the Anglo-Saxon stock. He subscribed to the North American Review, and he read with careful attention the arguments of those who claimed that the civilization of the West depended upon keeping out the Mongoloid races and the inferior peoples of Europe. He saw in the complaint about the Finn widow's house an opportunity to protect that civilization. He wrote a letter to Throckmorton, expressing his intention to investigate the matter personally, and he set off from Minneapolis by sleigh in early December. Whitcomb arrived in Cokato Village on the 9th of December, 1884. He took rooms at Throckmorton's boarding house and began his investigations. He visited 6 Finnish homesteads in the township, riding in a sleigh with Throckmorton as his guide, and at each stead he examined the exterior of the houses. At Aino's cabin, he refused to enter. Instead, he circled the cabin on horseback, examining the lime-coated seams from a distance, wrinkling his nose at the smell of the smoke sauna smoke, which he declared to be the reek of a Lapland yurta. his attempt to associate the sauna, which was an ancient Finnish structure, with the tent dwellings of the steppe peoples. Aino watched him from the doorway. She did not know what he said, but she could read his disdain in his face and in the way he held his horse to the side, as if contamination might reach him from the direction of her door. On the 18th of December, Whitcomb filed his preliminary report. In this document, he described the houses of the Finns, particularly Aino's hirsitalo, as heathenish daub construction smeared with cow orger and incantations, built by the Finn widow Niskanen, locally styled the Mud Witch of Section 19. He recommended to the General Land Office that the widow's homestead patent, the certificate of ownership that was due to be issued in the spring of 1885, after her 3-year residence requirement was complete, be withheld on the grounds that the structure does not meet permanent habitable construction of the character contemplated by the Homestead Act of 1862, according to Section 2291 of the revised statutes. This report reached Aino, translated by her daughter Helmi, who sat by the light of a tallow candle and slowly converted the English words into Finnish, speaking them aloud to her mother while Aino listened, her face in shadow. When Helmi finished reading the document, neither of them spoke for a long time. Aino understood that her 3 years of labor, the harvest of moss, the burning of the kiln, the mixing of the clay and the lime, the patient work of her hands, all of this had been deemed by a man on a horse, a man who had refused even to cross her threshold, to be witchcraft and unfitness. There was no recourse for her in the township. The Yankee schoolmaster had already expelled her youngest daughter, Inkeri, from the school in the autumn of 1884, claiming that the girl's mud-smeared garments offend hygienic standards. The church was not open to her. And now the land office, the instrument of the federal government, had declared her home unfit. But the winter had other ideas. On the 14th and 15th of January, 1885, a wet snow fell on Cokato Township. It fell for 30 hours straight, a heavy, clinging snow, the kind that comes when the temperature hovers near the freezing mark and the atmosphere is saturated with moisture. The snow accumulated to a depth of 8 inches, and it clung to the walls of the cabins and the frame houses of the township with a terrible weight. The moisture from the snow, as the temperature began to fall, was absorbed into the surfaces of the walls, and in the process of sublimation, the transformation of snow directly into water vapor, it drew heat from the wood and the mortar. By the 16th of January, the thermometer in Minneapolis was reading -30 degrees Fahrenheit. By the morning of the 17th of January, the temperature had fallen to -45 degrees Fahrenheit at the official station in Brainerd, and in the exposed reaches of Wright County, the cold was worse. The wind came from the north at 18 to 24 miles per hour, creating a wind chill equivalent that some observers later calculated to be nearly 78 degrees below zero. At that temperature and wind speed, the physics of construction became apparent with a terrible swiftness. The lime and sand mortar that the Yankee settlers had used to chink their single-pass log cabins, mortar that had cost them little effort and less thought, began to crack and separate from the log. The cold caused the lime to contract at a different rate than the logs themselves. The moisture in the mortar turned to ice, creating pressure from within the seam. And by the morning of the 17th, the seams of nearly every Yankee cabin in Cokato Township were admitting Arctic air directly into the living spaces, letting the cold reach into every room and corner. In Hiram Throckmorton's two-story frame house in Cokato Village, the interior walls began to ice over on the morning of the 17th, frost forming in patterns like the ferns of a distant forest. By noon, the temperature in the kitchen was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The family, Throckmorton, his wife Letitia, and their two sons, huddled in the parlor around the cooking stove, fully clothed, shaking beneath blankets, unable to warm the interior of their home despite the constant feeding of the fire. At Reverend Crandall's parsonage, a 4-foot section of the north wall chinking let go during the night of the 17th. The Reverend awoke to find Arctic air pouring directly into the parlor, and he realized with a clarity born of desperation that his family would not survive another night in that house without aid. At the Cokato Village schoolhouse, the water pipes had already frozen and burst, rendering the building unusable for days. The Reverend's prized brass globe, a globe showing the distribution of the Anglo-Saxon races across the hemispheres, had burst at its mounting from the contraction of the metal in the cold. Inspector Whitcomb, still boarding at Throckmorton's house, suffered a severe frostbite on his cheekbones and on the bridge of his nose from a mere 6-minute walk to the privy on the morning of the 17th. When he returned to the house, his nose tip was blackening, the tissues beginning to die. 2 Yankee homesteads on the outer edges of the township were abandoned. The families fled toward the village, their supplies inadequate, their wagons breaking down in the snow. A teamster from Smith Lake, caught on the road in the afternoon of the 19th, was found senseless by neighbors, barely alive, and had to be carried to the nearest shelter, which happened to be the cabin of Tatu Maki, one of the Triple-Chinked Finn homesteads. There he was revived and sheltered until the cold broke, but Aino's cabin remained warm. In the deepest darkness of the morning of the 19th of January, with the temperature standing at minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit outside, Aino measured the interior of her wall with the back of her hand. At the surface of the lime-coated seam, the temperature was 47 degrees Fahrenheit above zero. The triple-layered system, the sphagnum moss holding its insulating value, the flexible clay-and-dung mortar admitting no air, the lime coat shedding the ice and the driven snow, had transformed the 3-inch seam into a boundary so effective that the interior of the cabin remained in the 50s, comfortable, survivable. On the 18th and 19th of January, families began arriving at Aino's door. The Finns came first, neighbors from the section who had adequate shelter but wanted to share the warmth and the security of a house that was proving its worth. But then the Yankees came as well. Throckmorton himself appeared on the 19th, his wife wrapped in blankets, her extremities already showing the white of frostbite. He did not beg with words, he simply appeared, and Aino took them in. The sauna house, the traditional Finnish smoke sauna, the only smoke sauna in the county, became a center of healing. Aino heated it to the point where the air shimmered and the sweat could pour from the skin, and in that heat, the frost-injured tissues of the Yankee settlers began to recover. The sauna saved Letitia Throckmorton from the loss of her toes. It relieved the pain in the extremities of 3 other Yankee women. By the morning of the 20th of January, 28 souls were sheltering in Aino's cabin and sauna house, half of them Finn, half of them Yankee. Aino's parlor was converted to a sleeping room. The loft, where her 3 daughters normally slept, became a dormitory for the overflow. The kitchen, with its hearth and its chimney, became a communal living space. There was barely room to move, and the air was close with the breath of so many, but the walls remained warm, and no one froze. On the 20th of January, Inspector Whitcomb arrived at the cabin door. His sleigh had become mired, and his hands and face were exposed to the cold. His nose tip had turned a dark black, a sign of the tissue death of gangrene beginning. His lips were white. His eyes had the glassy aspect of a man sliding toward the final stages of exposure. He stood at the door of Aino's cabin, the cabin that he had declared in his report to be unfit for civilized habitation, and he requested shelter in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Aino looked at him. She looked at the blackening of his nose, at the tremor in his hands, at the desperation in his eyes. And she stepped back from the threshold and welcomed him into the warmth. She did not remind him of his report. She did not mention his refusal to enter her door just 6 weeks earlier. She simply took his coat, guided him to a seat near the hearth, and gave him warm broth to drink. Over the next 3 days, as the cold continued to hold the land in its grip, Whitcomb lay in the parlor of Aino's cabin, wrapped in multiple blankets, drinking hot liquids by the hour, feeling the circulation begin to return to his extremities. He watched as Aino tended to the other refugees, the Finns and the Yankees together, all of them dependent entirely upon her house and her knowledge and her quiet strength. He saw how she moved among them with a kind of grave attention, answering their needs with spare words, never remarking upon their previous hostility toward her. On the 22nd of January, the cold broke. A warm front moved in from the south, and the temperature rose above 0, then above 10, then above 20. By the 23rd, the world was beginning to thaw. On the 28th of January, still at the cabin, recovered enough to write, Inspector Whitcomb sat down with pen and paper and composed a letter to the General Land Office in Minneapolis. In that letter, he withdrew his preliminary adverse report. He wrote that he had been mistaken in his assessment of Aino Niskanen's construction. He recommended, without qualification, that her homestead patent be approved as soon as the 3-year residence requirement was complete. He did not explain, in his letter, what had changed his mind, but those who knew about the cold wave understood well enough. On the 14th of March, 1885, in a ceremony held at the General Land Office in Minneapolis, Aino Marie Niskanen was issued her homestead patent, the certificate that made the land and the house legally hers, the reward for her 3 years of residence and improvement. In April of that year, 3 Yankee homesteaders appeared at Aino's door, led by Charles Throckmorton, Hiram's nephew. They asked if she would teach them the 3-layer method of chinking, the kolmikeros tilkitsaminen, that had saved their families in the cold. Aino agreed. Through May and June, she conducted an informal school in her dooryard, showing the neighbors how to harvest and dry the sphagnum moss, how to mix the clay and cattle dung mortar, how to burn the lime in a stone kiln, and how to apply each layer with patience and care. 9 houses in the township were re-chinked with the 3-layer method before the snow came again in the autumn. The Throckmorton store began extending credit to Finnish customers. Mrs. Letitia Throckmorton resigned from the Cokato Ladies' Sanitary and Moral Association, the organization that had led the campaign against the Finn settlers. Reverend Crandall, in a sermon on the 11th of February, preached a public retraction, speaking of the charity of the stranger among us, though he did not mention Aino by name. Aino lived at Cokato Township until the year 1923. She died at the age of 73 years, and she was buried in the churchyard at Cokato, the same church that had once refused to seat her. Her cabin, the hirsitalo with the three-layer Karelian chinking, stood for many years as a monument to the knowledge of her grandmother and the patience of her own hands. In the summer of 1923, in the dooryard of that cabin, Aino sat on a bench in the sun, watching her grandchildren play and chase the dust in the warm air. The south-facing wall of her house, the wall that bore the lime coat that she had brushed on 40 years before, still showed its bright white surface in the afternoon sun. The lime had never failed. The moss still held its insulating value within. The mortar beneath still bore the weight and the movement of the logs, and the weather coat still shed the rain and the snow as if the hand that had applied it still moved upon it. In the morning cold of January, 6 decades after she had begun, that wall would still hold the interior temperature above the freezing mark, proof against the wind and the driven snow, faithful to the knowledge of her grandmother and the labor of her hands.